Well, hello, everybody. I'm Sherry Trimble. I'm one of the museum educators at the State Museum of Pennsylvania, and I want to welcome everyone to session number 2 of the 2020 Archaeology virtual presentations. We will have 2 more presentations coming up next week. We'll be meeting with Jean Sutherland. She's going to be talking about Lenapes and the colonists from a historic perspective. And then we're going to be meeting at the end with Dr. Bryce Obermeyer, and he's going to be talking about where are Delaware today. I want to just do some thank yous to the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation for all their support for programs such as this workshop. I know some of you have already supported the foundation with your donations. I will put in the link in the chat room if anybody else would like to contribute with future programs for the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation. So this year's theme is the Delaware Indians, then and now. And just some of the logistics. I'm gonna stop sharing here. Nope, I want to spotlight me. Still working on some of the logistics. There, thank you, Jenny. Want to remind everybody that this session is being recorded and will be distributed to the public on our YouTube and social media channels. We are almost done with video number 1 and will be coming out really soon. Once we have these recordings ready, we will be sending out an email to all the registered participants to let you know. And I also put in the chat box, if you go up to the top of the chat box, put in just if you have any issues with your connection, and also our social media about our policies for appropriate behavior. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kirk Carr, Senior Curator of Archaeology at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. Since 2007, Dr. Carr curates over 10 million artifacts in our collection. He and his staff actively excavate, publish, and present. Their blog post is a great way to know more about what they're doing, and I will be attaching that as well into the chat box. And we'll have that at the end. So it's just a great way of knowing what they're up to. During the program, I will be monitoring the chat room, and we'll keep an eye out for questions, so keep those going. But for now, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Carr.
Thank you, Sherry. Today's presentation is by Dr. Gregory Latonsi from the New Jersey State Museum, where he's worked for 20 years or so. Greg received his PhD in anthropology from Temple University in 2013 and became the state archaeologist of New Jersey in 2016, a very prestigious position. He publishes frequently on a variety of subjects, such as sourcing studies for Native American copper, Paleo-Indian adaptations, late woodland pottery, and he is considered an expert on artifacts of the contact period. His work has made significant contributions to our understanding of past cultural behavior in the Middle Atlantic region. I've known Greg for 20 years or so and consider him a respected colleague and friend. I sincerely appreciate his willingness to share his thoughts today on Delaware artifacts and culture during the contact period. Greg's presentation is titled The Contact Period in New Jersey, an Archaeological Perspective. He will focus on the time period when Europeans first invaded North America in the late 1500s, but through the 1700s, when the Delaware Indians learned how to adapt to the invaders, but were gradually losing their dominant position in the fur trade and struggling to maintain their cultural identity. The popular notion is that Indians hunted, fished, grew corn, trapped fur-bearing animals to trade with the Swedes, Dutch, and English. In exchange, they received colorful glass beads, copper kettles, iron knives and axes, muskets, and alcohol. Eventually, the animals were trapped out, the Delaware were devastated by disease, the fur trade moved to Western tribes, and even under the goodwill of William Penn, the Delaware were cheated out of their land in the walking purchase and driven out of their homes to disappear from the historic record. However, the story is much more complicated and more interesting, and actually one that we can apply to our world today. The Delaware recognized the advantages of European technology, but resisted changes to their cultural traditions. Greg is going to examine this period by using a couple of archaeological sites as case studies to illustrate Native American life and how the Delaware incorporated this new technology into their adaptation, but at the same time endeavored to maintain deep cultural traditions. This week, we will hear an archaeological perspective on the contact period. And next week, we will hear from historian Gene Sonderland and the evidence from historic documents. The following week, we will hear from Bryce Obermeyer, representing the Delaware Nation, and how the Delaware have survived and successfully preserved their cultural traditions and identity in Oklahoma. So Greg, I'll turn it over to you and go for it.
Kurt, thank you very much for those words. And thanks everybody for joining in here. And I want to first thank the State Museum of Pennsylvania for their invitation to speak today. And also want to thank the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation for making this event and the series possible. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Lenape, and I would like to pay my respects to the Lenape elders, both past and present. And I also like to thank the Delaware tribe, the Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge Munsee for allowing me to show an image of grave goods as part of my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I don't see my, uh-oh. Okay. Are we good?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay. So artifacts are material culture that allow us as archaeologists to determine the type of site we have and its potential period of occupation. Is it a prehistoric site, historic site, or maybe a little bit of both? Artifact meaning does change depending on the context, and so do our interpretations. Historic artifacts, even those that may have been used by indigenous people, are part of a complex material package that could constitute indigenous resistance to and residence in colonial worlds. And so we're looking at how the Lenape sort of survived in this environment, this drastically changing environment. Native American archaeological sites of the historic period can be used to address these tensions and disparities that exist within historical records and receive perceptions of encounters between the Lenape and Europeans. Early on, most of us have looked at diaries and journals of either Moravians or historical figures that talked about Lenape or other native groups, and we have to be careful when we actually try and interpret from that because we're looking at it through a different eye. When we're talking about contact, we should really be saying colonialism and everything that entails. And we must also realize that the contact period and thus contact is not brief, and it's not decisive, and it's not part of one-sided confrontations. And looking at collections in my museum, other museums, and sites that we're excavating, giving artifacts a voice, we begin to understand the role that they play in both hiding and revealing aspects of culture change that the Lenape endured. Oops, why can't I? There we go. Oh, got it. Okay, those received perceptions mentioned above are what occurred over the years when our interpretations have been hampered by our assumptions of what relative sites or deposits should look like. That is, we were looking for sites loaded with European goods and structurally different from their pre-contact precursors. Because that is what historic land deeds said we should find. Those lists of items traded to Native Americans by Europeans listed on deeds certainly might lead to such a conclusion, as seen in this example. So we have 30 guns, we have 20 kettles, 100 knives, 80 hatchets, lead, shot, 300 needles, 300 pipes, and more lead. Emphasizing the documentary sources, there can be a subtle, if not conscious, promotion of the European side of the story of colonialism, rather than a view of Native peoples doing things to maintain, redefine, or accommodate their identities. They're trying to negotiate their lives in a situation where they're not in control. So we see this, in today's world, where there are, the kind of adaptations that most minority groups being oppressed and marginalized face. And we also want to avoid the pitfalls of conflating and altering historic observations of Native peoples made at different times with archaeological evidence in order to create a fuller picture of American Indian life. So this quote sort of is the quote that got me going on looking at these two particular sites I'm going to explain. And can we see in the archaeological record Native cultures accommodating parts of their identity in order to define themselves within a ruling system, even while resisting aggression? And there are more and more archaeologists coming up with looking at sites, whether they're cemetery sites or habitation sites, in a different way, and looking at some of the small minutia and how the Native population are sort of negotiating or navigating this very fine line between resisting and acculturating. So moving forward, I would like you all to indulge with me in a thought experiment. So considering Native peoples in our region have been here for millennia, set in their social, cultural, and spiritual environments, it seems likely that there are some customs and rituals that would be amenable and maybe even necessary to adapt, remake, or change. And can we observe that evidence in the archaeological record? And hence the reason for that quote. So I'm going to talk about two sites in New Jersey, the Lenhart-Lawe site, which is located in Cream Ridge, Monmouth County. It's a cemetery site, and also the 1719 Trent House in Trenton, Mercer County, a domestic residential site. And these site types are where we see Native culture accommodating parts of their identity in order to redefine themselves within this system, even while resisting its eventual overcoming of their native lifeways. Mahlon Stacy was the first permanent English settler in the area known today as Trenton. He owned all the land to a considerable extent about the Assunpink Creek on both sides thereof and the Delaware River back for a considerable distance. Stacy's home plantation comprised around 500 acres, which he called Ballafield, named for his ancestral home in England. He had a mill that was built on the south bank of the Assunpink, adjacent to a road called York Road, which is now Broad Street in Trenton. There was also a ferry going across the Delaware River just south of his home that he owned and operated. He died at his home on April 3rd in 1704. In 1714, the year this survey was made, Mahlon Stacy Jr., Mahlon's son, sold 800 acres of his father's grist mill tract to William Trent, a prominent wealthy Philadelphia merchant. Many attempts are still underway to find Mahlon Stacy's original house, which may be located somewhere in and around the Trent House or underneath the Trent House, totally destroyed at this point. So some of the finds recently, in 2019, last summer, the Monmouth University Archaeological Field School under the direction of Dr. Richard Veit, along with work carried out by Hunter Research Incorporated, a cultural resource management firm based in Trenton. They conducted a field school and additional excavations. Hunter Research has been carrying out excavations on this property since the 1990s on a limited scale, and only now are they actually opening up larger areas. All the images here are here are courtesy of the Hunter Research firm, and they're used by permission with from the Trent House Board of Trustees. I'm going to be talking about Unit 1403, which you can see right there. There's the original well to the left. That stone foundation is the kitchen kitchen outbuilding. So during the excavation of the kitchen wing, or outside the kitchen wing, the context was identified as being directly on top of the subsoil, context 28, which you can see right here. I'll highlight it for you. And context 28 is considered the late 17th, early 18th original ground surface. Within this context were finds of an incised pipe bowl, you see on the lower left, the lower right, a rectangular piece of folded metal on the top of the screen, 6 sherds of what archaeologists are temporarily or congenitally saying at this point are columnware, more than likely from a single vessel. And based on this and other finds, so there were 114 additional prehistoric finds that were found in this context. Oops, I'm not sure why. There we go. Okay. So these other artifacts, there were historic artifacts, structural brick, personal, smoking pipes, there's the copper trade good, but also you'll see 114 prehistoric artifacts, other ceramics, and a lot of flakes. Okay. And I'm interpreting this part of this occupation level as being, and the pipe bowl as well as those ceramics, as being made by Native Americans. They're made with what appear to be metal tools. The pipe has a metal rouletting on it, and it's extremely similar to other contact period native made pipes that we have in our collection from a number of different sites in New Jersey, as well as a metal object being used for the incised comb. Those additional pottery sherds, many flakes, and other stone debitage. The context is believed to be that original ground surface of the late 1700s, about the time of Malin Stacy Jr. And it's possible this presence of purely prehistoric artifacts suggests that native peoples were here doing something at the site. We're not exactly sure whether they were making things or involved in the construction of Trent's new house. We're going to be looking at next summer, they're going to be excavating some more. On top of context 28 was context 8 right there that you can see. This was a possible fill from the construction of William Trent's house on top of the original ground surface. Late 18th, 19th century yard garden soil sealed the context 28. And basically it's interpreted as the construction fill or construction debris when they were making Malin Stacy's house. That deposit had several plaster and brick fragments, a single sherd of redware, a triangular piece of copper, which you see in the upper right, definitely cut with some knife or some other like metal scissors to cut. And I've seen a lot of these at a number of different contact period sites where we have metal debris, and that's sort of what ticked me off to this being a possibility. And since the folded metal was found in 28, and the triangle piece here was found in the level above it, hopefully it would be nice to do some sourcing study, particularly XRF, X-ray fluorescence, where numerous contact period sites in Canada and upstate New York and in Pennsylvania, archaeologists have identified signatures that they're able to compare different pieces of metal. And if these two pieces from different contexts are the same, it's possible that this level, which the archaeologists might believe that it's the same level 8 and 28, that it's from the same time period. So one of the things is, did Mayle and Stacy establish some sort of trading post as the records have us believe? Remember I mentioned before about historical records. Trading posts are great spots for Native peoples to exchange and get goods. The ferry, obviously the operation of the ferry. What was the nature at this point of interaction between Mayle and Stacy and William Trent and the Lenape? We know that they have occupied this bluff area in Trenton, north and south, for tens of thousands of years. And while sites appear to have preponderance of historical material with occasional prehistorics like this one, what's not here? And that's what I was really intrigued by. And there's no diagnostics. There's no food processing tools. There's no food storage pits. There's no pits with refuse. And we're hoping that the upcoming field schools will be able to identify other artifacts, other features that could help fill in that gap. So unfortunately, we're left at this point sort of contemplating. We believe that there's Native people here. We just don't know exactly what they're doing or their role playing in this site. So hopefully next summer's field schools will answer some more questions. Okay. So the next site is the Lenhart-La-Hawe site. And this was identified during the 1930s in the WPA project for the State Museum. It's about 2 miles from this town of Cream Ridge. As you can see, it is along the Crosswicks Creek, and La-Hawe Creek is what comes straight up off of the Crosswicks. The La-Hawe section is below the Crosswicks Creek, as you can see. I typed it in there. The Lenhart site is where the red arrow is pointing to. It occupied the lower part of a sloped, gently rising hill. La-Hawe Creek is about 8 feet wide at this point. And the reason why archaeologists from the State Museum came to the site was they found 8 previous skeletons in the high bank. And we think that they're located between the road and where that excavation is, where the red arrow is pointing, because they said it was 100 yards from the road. So no other information, unfortunately, was written about the previous skeletons being found, nor any grave goods that ended up. And so, gotta do this. So the private collectors are 2 individuals, and I'm just listing here so that you can get an idea of some of the other artifacts that were found on the Lenhart site area. So pestles, a gorget, banner stone, lots of pottery, large anvil. This was very interesting. Mr. Smith had arrowheads, drills, pitted anvils, a clay pipe fragment found with a British coin, and lead musket. And unfortunately, no other notes exist as to what type of British coin, which would be helpful. There were 11 trenches done at the Lenhart site. 8 burials were newly identified, 148 lithic artifacts, 450 or so pottery sherds, and a number of trade items were identified. 5 of the 8 burials, 5 had historic artifacts, 2 had no grave goods at all, and 1 unsexed child had a chert arrowhead near the right scapula, so underneath the shoulder. All the burials were lying on their left side except 2, which were lying on their right. And here's a plan of the excavation layout of where those burials were. They were also found intermittent with a bunch of pits. the position of all the skeletons, you can see, oops, I'm hitting the wrong thing. Here's a list of the burials I wanted to get, and also the grave goods. So there are 8 total burials and 8 from before. So if these are all related, there is a total of 16. So the position of all 8 skeletons was northeast to southwest, as you can see here, except for the 2 lying on their right side. Only the females had grave goods, which I'll get to in a minute. And there appears to be no burial objects at all placed with the males at the site. Only 1 adult male and an infant male were the 2 that didn't have any. So the woman and the infant, I'm just going to talk about. The adult female had an incised copper bracelet and a trade pipe in her right hand. And she also had 250 black and 26 white trade beads under her skull. More than likely it was around the neck. The infant was dug into a larger pit that already existed, and this may relate somehow to a concept that the Lenape revisit areas that are significantly special to them, whether it's landscape or people have been buried, and they'll go back and rebury newer individuals, or they'll put in, they'll build a fire and have a feast and then bury that. And what made me think about that possibility was while the burial of the infant had nothing in it, the larger pit had the underside of a snapping turtle, half of a turtle shell, thumb scraper, a roulette impressed rim pottery sherd, spearhead, 66 other sherds, plain sherds, and then a jasper hoe. And so that is kind of interesting in and of itself. Now, the quote that I had before of Nancy, he's an archaeologist who has done extensive work in New England with a lot of contact period sites. And the quote, along with what you see here, burials oriented northeast, southwest, historic artifacts as grave goods, prehistoric artifacts are also included in this, in some burials. Adult female with grave goods. That might have something to do with the matrilineal aspect of Algonquian people, specifically Lenape, where they trace their descendancy through the female line. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the females have very elaborate grave goods. The fact that she's placed with that could be that. It's little acts like those. So the way that all these cemeteries in Rhode Island, the 2 cemeteries on the left, RI 1000 and West Ferry, seem to jump out at me that, hey, they're oriented in the same direction. There are little differences, but that's one of these aspects that archaeologists must sort of get involved with and understand, that there might be some, reason why Native peoples are aligning their burials in a certain way, possible as a resistance or an accommodation. Obviously, using grave goods that are historic is one of those ways that they accommodate themselves or accommodate their ritual environments to adapt to a colonial environment. Here is a picture of the grave goods that were found in the female and the other female burials. The triangular point that's in the center, number 7, was found actually in one of the other excavations on the Hawe site. So that was across the creek. The bracelet, unfortunately, can't get a good photograph of it, but that is incised around with just striations. Those are the beads. There's the 2 pipes that were found. And also the 1, 2, 3, 4 are small copper sort of filaments. They're historic copper pieces. and then what's described as a gorget fragment there. So for Native American sites of the historic period, one should not automatically assume that the site exists in a vacuum. There we go. What we are looking at is the struggle of Native peoples trying to navigate and negotiate their cultural identity among both indigenous and colonial populations. Colonial populations that are forcefully infringing themselves and pushing them further and further away and out of the region. The context in which these artifacts take on or embodied with different meaning, borrowing or using objects, ideas or concepts related to self-identity or something with their culture, is something which sometimes is archaeologically visible in a mortuary context. And one of the great things about working at a museum is that we have these resources to re-examine these collections, which, as was said earlier, Kurt has 10 million objects. I may have a little less than that, but those collections are valuable resources for myself and for students wanting to learn or reevaluate, look at a collection in a different way. And as far as cemetery goes, individual social strategies are obviously are variable. Social actions were motivated by different perceptions of the nature of cultural encroachment of Europeans and the appropriate means for rationalizing this changing worldview. So how did Native people, come to grips with themselves and the changing issues that were going on, social, environmentally? How did they react to that? How did they adapt to that? The presence of grave goods with only females is interesting. Why were there smoking pipes? Could this be an aspect, like I mentioned before, matrilineal? Excavations will begin again at the Trent House, and it will be possible to find some ways to answer those questions about Native American presence at the site. I'm reminded of the beaver fur trade, the Lenape, the Dutch, and the English, and also the Susquehannocks, going back and forth across the river at this time. So you've got the ferry with Mahlon Stacy, and the ferry's bit was there up until the Revolutionary War. And hopefully we'll look at that scale of interaction at that point. As with all archaeological sites, confusion may occur when we misidentify or misinterpret not only the individuals who caused the site to be in the first place, but also the material culture, how it may have been used or not used. We must also remember that any objective interpretations of the archaeological record are ideologically charged while serving to empower those with access to the record. Meaning, I am a white archaeologist, I'm not a Native individual. When I excavate a site that have Native objects, I need to consult Native people and look at and get their interpretation, because early on, we have different ideas and of the way things are, the context of those artifacts. And I think for me, working in New Jersey, that has been extremely helpful in having that dialogue open. The fact that we can bring new light to older collections like the Lenhart Lawe site affords us the opportunity to bring those interpretations to a wider archaeological and general audience, which is one of the reasons why I'm speaking today. So no matter the type of site, cemetery or residential, when we remove our rose-colored glasses, for a more conservative yet accommodating indigenous lifestyle emerges. One that is independent at the same time as being resistant, and one that fiercely holds on to the past, all the while constantly remaking itself in the present. So I would like to thank everyone listed here and thank the State Museum of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation for the invitation to speak to you. Thank you.
Greg?
Yes.
Hello, sorry about that. That's
Oh.
me. I was talking and not turning off my mute.
Oh, no.
So what we're going to be doing now is all the questions are going to be going through the chat room, which I've already seen several coming through, and I'm going to do my best to try and get them all going. Dr. Latonsi, you're going to answer. Kurt, we're going to have you pop in too to further add anything to these as well. So the first question is there any indication at the Lenhart site whether the burials, and I don't want to botch anybody's names, is a specific branch of the Lenape, such as the Munsee or the Unami?
So no, there's no indication, but the location of them being in central Jersey, in Monmouth County, if you're going to use the historical, references, we would probably say that they're Unami.
Okay, all right. Back to the Lenhart site again. Are the Lenhart artifacts materials used by the natives? Do you see that significance? Are some of the objects traded from the Europeans?
So that's one of the questions that we're almost never going to know how they got them, but they got them from Europeans. They also may have gotten them from other relatives that they got them from Europeans, but we know that at that point, there are a number of trading posts, there are a number of negotiations that are going on. At some point, and you saw in the deed description that there was 30 guns or something like that. At some point later on, the guns are removed from being traded with native peoples. The English did not want to have guns in the hands of the Lenape or any native group for that matter. So whether or not they got them as a trading or bought them, exchanged for baskets, maybe for pipes, at this point, that's what we sort of are assuming.
So, questions about the burials. So, is there significance to the gender being buried on the left or the right side?
Kurt may want to speak to this as far as I think what the chamber site, but I don't know at this point. We have a number of sites at the State Museum where there are contact period that we have other human remains, and I have not, unfortunately, looked at that to start comparing. But I know that there are a number of sites as the Delaware cemetery sites, as the Delaware moved west, that we can look at as comparisons, but not sure exactly why.
Kurt, have any thoughts on that one?
Some suggestion that early contact period sites and prehistoric sites, the burials are facing east, and later, and I have to look at Kuskuski Chambers. I thought that was an example of where they face west, as if the rising sun was important, but moving west later in time had some other significance. Because by that time, most, at least in Pennsylvania, most had moved west into Western Pennsylvania or out of the state altogether.
Right.
So some about the copper artifacts. Any idea where, is it from a local deposit? Has anybody actually examined the copper itself?
No, so those were just found last summer, and that site report is still being written. And I've already approached the archaeologists about trying to get an examination of those copper artifacts. One of the things that was interesting, so if you remember the slide, context 8 and then 28, 8 was on top of 28. The archaeologists, when they were excavating, had a difficult time identifying any difference 8 going into 28. And so even though they made that boundary, it is possible that whole 828 is one layer. And that would mean that the copper the two copper artifacts are from the same layer, as opposed to what I showed you, separate 2 layers. Just because the archaeologists, when they were excavating, couldn't be 100% definitive as to the interface between those 2 soils. So what they're going to do in next summer is try and identify that level in other places and try and compare that. But yes, so the copper will be hopefully analyzed and we'll be able to see it. But since it is European, it's going to have probably not from any copper sources in New Jersey or elsewhere in the Middle Atlantic, but it could have some traces of some elements in there that might be from the local.
Are there any markings on anything that might look familiar?
Markings on the copper?
Mm-hmm.
No, not that I've seen. There's scratch marks, or looks like a gouge marks on that triangle piece. But other than that, there's no other markings, X's or crosses or something on there.
So a little bit more, you brought up the firearms. Of course, that's going to bring up some questions. So when were European firearms commonly adopted and infrequently used by the indigenous people?
Well, I know, so in the Swedes, Dutch, in the early late 1500s, the 1600s, Native peoples did have firearms. And I know that when the English took over 1664, the whole area, that they stopped that practice. I'm not sure. Obviously, they probably did get them through other means, but I'm not exactly sure when that that prohibition stopped, when they were able to get firearms, legally, or under the English crown. If I'm not sure if Kurt knows. Do you know, Kurt?
Yeah, by 1640, muskets are pretty common among Susquehannocks.
Right.
And 1660, you find lots of muskets in burials, but most of them are damaged. So they weren't even, the original they were putting in as personal items, but later on they were putting them in as personal items, but they weren't functional anymore. A lot of them were.
Were the Susquehannocks getting their firearms from the French?
No, we think they were getting them from the English. Actually, originally the Susquehannocks, the English were working with the Susquehannocks for the trade. Gotcha. And John Smith actually sent people up to a major Susquehannock village. It was fortified, and we assume that they were getting their guns from the English in Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay area.
Okay.
They allegedly they had a cannon. And of course, we've looked all over the place for the cannon. And that would have come from the English also.
Yeah. Well, I think the Lenape at that point, while the Susquehannocks may have had guns, the Lenape, I don't think were allowed to have them, or at least the ones near New York City, for the reason that there was a lot of skirmishes going on at that time in the 1650s, well, 1660s, 70s, 80s.
I don't want to skip the question, but I think we answered it. But if we didn't answer the question on the comment of the northeast to southwest orientation, please put that back in the chat box. But for now, I'm going to skip that question because I think we answered it. So we have another question, and just maybe to one or the other. Have you had any thoughts on comparing the contact artifacts between the lower Delaware region compared to the Water Gap region?
Yeah, that's, yes, I've had thoughts about that. That would be a big undertaking. I'm trying to see or look at the, as far as the sites that we have at the New Jersey State Museum that I can readily access, and then do as much information gathering and thinking about those, and then move out. But very familiar with Herb Craft, Kinsey's work, Roger Muller, work up in the Upper Delaware, the Park Service, and the collections that are there. So yeah, that's something I'll be looking at in the future.
Yeah, and it's exciting because you're just, you've only gotten 1 year in, so there's hopefully many more years for you to come on building this one up. All right, so we've got lots more questions. A little bit about the burials. So at the Lenhart site, has a function of the pits been determined? Are they related to the burials, or are they just coincidence, previous usage?
So that what was a little difficult to determine, which I'm still getting into, was when the archaeologists in the 30s were excavating this site, they considered burials pits. And so they wrote in the catalog pit numbers and decided they weren't going to put burial. They just put, like, we would just know what bone, we would say human bone, but not the number of the skeleton. So I am slowly trying to, weed out what was in each pit, whether it had a burial or not. Most of the burials, even though they're called pits, the ones that had grave goods, that was pretty much it. The other pits have artifacts, some faunal, which no one's really looked at the faunal to see what kind of animals are in there. So hopefully we can, when we get back into the museum, we can take a look at those pit contents and answer some of those questions. But it would be interesting. That would take a little bit longer to get all the material together from the notes and everything. So, but thanks, that's a good question.
All right, so the Lenhart site, so close to the Great Adventure. Was there any consideration for the dig in that area?
Well, I know that, so if they were, whenever they built Great Adventure, if that was in the early 80s, then they probably did a cultural resource survey. If it was built earlier than 76, maybe not. But so we have all, at the State Museum, we have also site files. So we have all the registered archaeological sites in the state. So people who do projects and are developments like Great Adventure, they have to, professional archaeologists have to come to the State Museum to do background research. And so they would know if there's sites in that area.
So earlier we were talking about the copper. Somebody else was bringing up the lead. And was that European origin, or do they know of any possible local sources for that?
There are local sources for lead, but not in New Jersey, as far as I know. If they are, they're much, much deeper. But most of the lead you'll see written in deeds is European.
Okay. They were mentioning something about Fort Robidoux in Blair County. It's a possible source.
Oh.
Maybe.
Hmm.
All right. Well, this one's an interesting one. Totally switching gears, but I think a great question. Do you have any advice for an undergrad archaeological student? And what should they do?
Well, if they haven't had unfortunately, well, just pretend that there's no pandemic going on. My advice, depending on what year you're in, if you haven't had an archaeological field school, sign up for a field school. Most universities that have a fairly active and flourishing anthropology, archaeology department have a field school, so you can get experience. And load up on classes, find out what you're interested in researching, whether it's historic period, colonial archaeology, whether it's prehistoric, whether it's, you could be interested in architecture, changes in architecture, but definitely find, there are a number of archaeology firms that hire part-time field techs, but you have to have some experience beforehand. But if you're interested in the museum field, a number of universities in New Jersey and Pennsylvania have some museum studies programs that you can be study for collections manager, registrar, or ultimately curator. And basically, you can be, we have a number at the State Museum. The registrars, collections managers for cultural history and fine art have an archaeology background, which is kind of funny. So there's more archaeologists at my museum than probably most. But yeah, feel free. Hopefully my email will be passed around at some point, but feel free to contact me later. And if you have any other specific questions, I can answer.
Yeah, I agree with Greg. I would also suggest, getting as much experience as possible. So if you can volunteer someplace, I know under COVID it's a lot more difficult. We aren't accepting volunteers anymore, but you really need to get that experience. I was very fortunate in my career. I started in high school, and I just sort of fell into this whole thing. But I had lots of experience, and when it came to going to college, I already had more experience than many people there. And in graduate school, I practically had more experience than my advisor. Having experience is good, but also just experiencing different archaeological settings. So, and I'm mostly talking about field schools. Well, not field schools, but just field work, survey, intensive excavation, all of that thing in stratified sites, non-stratified sites, rock shelters, all those kinds of things. The more experience you get in those conditions, the more valuable you're going to be to future employers. Mm. But Greg's also right. The museum field, this is where we really need people. The field, everybody wants to dig. And nobody wants to stay in the basements of museums, pouring through all kinds of minutiae. But again, those are places where there are lots of jobs too, or at one time there were.
What's very funny is that I think one of the first times I ever went to an archaeological sort of mini conference or conference was the PA workshops in archaeology. I drove out to Harrisburg, and I was an undergrad in my first year, and this was, I believe, 1987.
It would have been a very early one.
Yeah, one of the really early ones. Uh-huh. And I was like, and I knew what I wanted. I knew I wanted to be an archaeologist since I was about 10. That's in a whole other story and program. So that's when I first saw and met Kirk Carr. He probably doesn't remember that, but.
Oh, I do. Yes. You get a different hairstyle.
Yeah, of course. Don't we all? But yeah, that was, pretty amazing that I could go places and be a part of this community that looks at artifacts and talks about the past, and in a way that brings it alive. Was just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, and I think, well, if you looked at the chat room, and I won't bring those up, but they did mention a couple other schools that are doing programs to check that out. But right. I do think it's great that I think technology today, Zoom calls like this today, open up these opportunities. So keep looking out for other ones. But yeah. All right, back to the topic at hand. Would you attribute the execution, I'm not going to pronounce this right, the Wiggahala in New Jersey in 1727 to the migration of many Lenape west across the river, including the family of Tidiscum a few years later? Sorry if I botched names.
That's probably something I'd have to look into a little bit more. I don't. A lot of things happened at that time, and it would be interesting to see what other kind of records there may exist aside from the one-sided records that are passed down. But yeah, I certainly don't want to interpret that right now, unless I do some more research on that. So I apologize.
Kurt, any thoughts? Do you have any do any research on any of that? On the migration west in 1727? That's okay.
I was interrupted here. I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
So they were
There's
asking
some
the
other
questions
things going
about
on here.
the migration from New Jersey out west in 1727 of the execution of the Wigahal. I'm pronouncing the name bad. Wigahal family and the Tidaska.
Diascon, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
No, I know Delaware were moving out during that time, but I don't know the particulars.
Okay. All right. Well, we are at the hour mark. We officially hit it. Any last minute questions? So just to remind everybody, a couple other people have asked, this session has been recorded, as well as the first and as well as the next two that are coming up. We'll eventually be getting on YouTube. I think we finally figured out the tech, so we're hoping that actually they will be coming out very soon. And if you're on, of course, the email list, we'll be emailing the list, the YouTube channel links. Next Friday, October 16th at noon, we'll be hearing about the Lenapes and the colonists in the lower Delaware Valley from 1624 to 1700 from Gene Sutherland. And this time we're coming from the history perspective. So I'm a history educator, so I'm excited about all those possibilities. All right, I knew this would happen. As I talked, people would ask a question. As a CRM worker, here myself, I gotta say, I'm trying to get what's going on here. I'm not sure what the question was there. I guess it was just getting into, I'm not gonna get into that. Not sure what that is.
Well, I'd like to quickly take this opportunity to thank Greg. It's a very stimulating, very interesting presentation, Greg. And really, this is an exciting time in archaeology because, archaeologists are starting, such as Greg and I, old white guys. I guess he's a younger white guy. But yes, we are interpreting other people's culture, and we need to involve them in that interpretation and in the story that we tell. And I just find this a really stimulating idea. It's difficult. I find it difficult.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Because we have our perspectives and Native peoples have their perspectives. And so it is, but it's exciting and interesting. And I think we're, obviously we're seeing more and more of that in the archaeological literature.
All right, one other pub question comes up. If you could speculate, because you're speculating, when do you think the Lenape appeared in the Trent House site area? And do you think they were there before that as well?
Oh yeah, they definitely were, because in another section of the property where they were excavating, they found an intact prehistoric site, late Archaic to Middle Woodland, I believe. I'm not exactly sure, so don't quote me. If anybody from Hunter Research is on this, you may want to chime in. So that area is the Falls of the Delaware, which is the end of tide right there. And so the Abbott Farm, which is a National Historic Landmark prehistoric site, heavily occupied in the Middle Woodland, is about 1.5 miles, 2 miles south of there. That whole bluff, the whole area, was occupied for thousands of years. So there are native presence all along that high bluff overlooking the Delaware River. So yeah, there's even within the property, or actually outside that Trent House, there's an intact prehistoric site. So hopefully they'll be able to, they're trying to figure out the different occupations, prehistoric and historic, at the time during, over time.
I got a kudos here from somebody saying that they said, great to hear about your cooperation with Indigenous descendants. It says they'd love to hear more about that, but I have a sneaking suspicion that's probably number 4 in our discussion.
Yeah, we have, I'm on the New Jersey Commission for American Indian Affairs, and that is a group of state recognized local group, native groups that are within the state of New Jersey and or New York. And so I'm directly involved with talking with them, as well as the federally recognized tribes that I mentioned in the paper, that I deal with for other issues like, native, like NAGPRA. So we, over the many years, developed a very close working relationship with all the groups that call New Jersey their home.
Well, I don't see any other questions, so I think we have come to the end, which is awesome. We definitely filled it, and we still have 61 participants still hanging on with us. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Sherry.
See you soon, I hope.
I hope so.
Yes. Take care. Be safe.
Yes, you too.
That was awesome. Thanks so much, guys. We appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
we maxed at 108.
108.
Yep.
And 91 at question and answer.
Yep, you held that pretty much all the way through, so that's really awesome.
Yeah, I get to report those numbers to my museum director.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's great and I think it's great to maintain the numbers through the question and answer, that they still find that a lively part of this.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. Well, thank you so much for all your help, and I'm glad the PowerPoint went off okay.
It all worked fabulously. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. And I'll make sure we get this link to you as well, and let your museum director know. We'll tag you on social media.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yeah. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.